1859, beneath the sweltering Georgia sun, a story unfolded that official history has spent more than a century trying to erase. It begins not with triumph, not with tragedy, but with a silence, an unnatural quiet that fell over the small town of Darien the day the Whitaker siblings disappeared. 4 children born of one bloodline, raised under the same roof, vanished without leaving behind a single footprint. Their names were spoken in whispers, never written in the county records again, as though the town itself conspired to scrub them from existence. And when researchers decades later dared to examine what little remained, their hands shook so violently that the files were sealed. To this day, the archives of Georgia's medical and historical societies list the Whitaker case only under one phrase: classified, do not release. You are about to hear why. The Whitaker siblings were not ordinary children. They were born under a shadowed alignment in 1841, their births recorded not by a physician, but by the pastor of a splinter church that no longer exists. Their parents, Samuel and Eliza Whitaker, were respected landowners, outwardly pious, deeply woven into the social fabric of Darien. Yet the children carried something in their blood that unsettled the community from the moment they began to speak. Town records suggest that the siblings often finished each other's sentences, not in play, but with a precision so perfect it was as if 4 mouths spoke with a single mind. Teachers described the youngest, Catherine, reciting entire pages of scripture backwards without ever reading them. Farmhands swore they saw the brothers, Thomas and Nathaniel, moving in unison while ploughing, their bodies mirroring each other's actions as though controlled by one will. Neighbors grew uneasy. Animals fled when the siblings walked past, and most chilling of all, none of the children cast proper shadows after dusk. When the fever of 1859 swept through coastal Georgia, Darien's cemeteries filled with fresh graves. Dozens died in a single month. Yet the Whitaker siblings did not fall ill. Not one cough, not one fever. Survivors whispered that the plague had spared them because something older than death itself lived in their veins. By autumn, the community had reached a breaking point. The Whitaker farmhouse became a place people avoided, though no one dared confront the family directly. And then, one October night, the children vanished, locked away, some say, not by strangers, but by institutions that still hold their bodies hidden. This is where the descent begins. The disappearance of the Whitaker siblings was never recorded as a crime. No missing persons report, no search parties, not even a funeral. In Darien, Georgia, 1859, it was as if 4 children simply evaporated into the humid night air. But silence, as every student of history learns, is never the absence of truth. It is the burial of it. What little survives comes not from town ledgers or church logs, but from fragments hidden in letters, private journals, and scattered testimonies left behind by men who quickly regretted writing them. One physician, Dr. Elias Morton, scribbled a line in his diary 3 days after the Whitakers vanished. They were removed for study, alive. The order came from Savannah, though the seal was not military nor medical. I dare not write more. His handwriting breaks into blotches after that sentence, as though his hand trembled too much to continue. Who issued the order? What was meant by study? Those questions have haunted researchers for over a century, but one thing is clear: the siblings were not lost in the chaos of an epidemic. They were taken. Before that night, their presence in the community had become almost unbearable. Farmers complained of hearing whispers in their fields when the siblings passed by, though no lips were moving. Several mothers refused to let their children play near the Whitaker property, claiming their sons and daughters would return home in tears, speaking words no one recognized, words with sharp, guttural sounds that did not belong to English or to anything earthly. There is also the case of Reverend Jonathan Hale, the Methodist preacher who once called the Whitaker children angels preserved by God during a Sunday sermon. Weeks later, his tone shifted. His final entry before leaving town reads, "They do not dream as other children do. They visit one another in visions. I saw them speak across distance, with no words, no gestures. Yet the meaning was exact. This is not divine. This is older than faith, and it frightens me." After the siblings vanished, Reverend Hale resigned his position, abandoned his congregation, and fled north. He never returned to Georgia. The townsfolk, fearful of both disease and scandal, chose to smother the story. But in truth, the Whitakers had already drawn the attention of forces much larger than a frightened community. Behind the curtain of silence, institutions with money, laboratories, and hidden agendas had begun circling. The siblings were not forgotten, they were claimed. And once they were claimed, nothing human remained in their story. The Whitaker siblings did not vanish into myth. They were taken by men who carried no uniforms, yet moved with the authority of those who answer to powers above government. Their carriage arrived after midnight, its wheels muffled with cloth, its lanterns extinguished. Neighbors later said they heard no horses, no doors opening, no shouts or cries, just silence, and then the farmhouse was empty. By dawn, 4 beds lay undisturbed, 4 plates still set at the table, as if the children had risen mid-meal and walked willingly into the dark. But they had not gone willingly. Fragments of correspondence between county officials and the Society for Biological Inquiry, an organization with no public records before 1860, point to what really happened. The society was not a church, nor a government bureau. It was something older, seeded in Europe, migrating to American soil in the 1830s under the guise of medical advancement. Its true interest was not in curing disease, but in mastering it, selecting anomalies, studying them, bending them towards secret ends. The Whitakers were the perfect anomaly, 4 siblings connected by blood, immune to the fever that emptied graveyards, and linked by a psychic thread that defied explanation. The Society's agents had been watching since the first reports reached Savannah. Letters between physicians reveal coded phrases: the children of symmetry, the quartet without shadow, subjects resilient to pestilence. Each phrase points to the same conclusion: the Whitakers were considered specimens, not souls. And Georgia was not their first harvest. Records from Massachusetts in 1812 speak of twin sisters who survived smallpox untouched, then vanished from their village overnight. In Virginia, 1837, 3 brothers immune to yellow fever disappeared after a visit from federal surveyors. The Whitakers fit a pattern, one that reveals a quiet program running beneath the surface of American expansion, an invisible hand collecting children who resisted death. The people of Darien chose not to resist. Fear and superstition silenced them, but silence was the very currency the society depended upon. No outcry, no investigation, no scandal, just another family reduced to rumor. But one man did resist, Dr. Elias Morton. His diary suggests he attempted to follow the carriage south towards Savannah. He returned broken, muttering about experiments that did not respect the boundaries of flesh and soul. Weeks later, he was found hanging in his study, his journal pages torn out, burned in the fireplace. The Whitakers had become property, and property, in the hands of men like these, is never returned. The society did not deliver the Whitaker siblings to an orphanage or a school. They were transported to a facility hidden along the Ogeechee River, its walls disguised as a derelict mill, its basement lined with stone foundations older than the Revolution itself. Local farmers thought it abandoned. In truth, it was alive with instruments no Georgian had seen before: iron restraints, glass cylinders filled with preserved organs, and books bound in languages most physicians could not read. The children were separated upon arrival. Isolation was the first experiment. If the Whitakers' strange immunity came from a shared consciousness, the society needed to know what happened when that bond was severed. Diaries from an assistant physician describe nights when one child would scream in his cell, moments before another collapsed in silence down the hall, as if one's pain echoed inside the other's body. Their pulses danced to the same clock, he wrote. To divide them is to divide the rhythm of life itself. Next came the exposure trials. The siblings were placed in controlled chambers with infected rats, contaminated blankets, and vials of yellow bile drawn from plague victims. One by one, the assistants expected the disease to bloom. But nothing came. Their skin never blistered, their lungs never drowned, their fevers never rose. Instead, the physicians grew ill. One attendant contracted cholera and died within days, while the children remained untouched. It was as if the diseases recoiled from them. Blood was drawn by the pint. Notes show that the society attempted transfusion, injecting the Whitakers' blood into terminal patients. Some survived briefly, their symptoms slowing, their strength returning, only to collapse later in fits of delirium. The blood resists corruption, the records read, but it resists obedience as well. What unsettled the researchers most was not their bodies, but their minds. On several occasions, a child would answer a question before it was asked, finishing a sentence as if plucking it from the doctor's throat. One boy, Samuel, allegedly whispered the exact words of a physician's private prayer, recited silently in his head. The staff began to wear charms, crosses, even carrying salt in their pockets, convinced the siblings were not merely immune, but inhabited by something unholy. Yet the society did not stop. Their obsession grew. If the Whitakers could resist disease, then perhaps they could be remade, turned into the foundation of a new human design. But experiments that begin with wonder always end in cruelty. By the spring of 1860, the Whitaker children no longer resembled the pale, frightened orphans who had entered the society's river mill. The experiments had altered them, not in ways visible to the untrained eye, but in subtle fractures of selfhood, places where innocence had been stripped away and replaced with something colder. The youngest, Eliza, once prone to humming hymns under her breath, grew silent. She refused to speak for weeks at a time, yet physicians recorded hearing whispers in their sleep, Eliza's voice calling their names, always from the corner of the room, though she was locked behind iron doors. Jonathan, the eldest, developed an unnatural calm. He endured bloodlettings and isolation without so much as a flinch, even when leeches were applied, until he nearly fainted. The notes describe him staring directly into the physician's eyes, unblinking, as if daring them to see what lived beneath his flesh. One attendant claimed Jonathan's pupils did not constrict in lamplight. They dilated endlessly, as if his eyes were swallowing the dark. But the most disturbing case was Samuel. Once quick to laughter, he began convulsing at night, his body arching against the restraints. Between fits, he muttered fragments of languages he had never been taught, Latin phrases from medical texts, Greek words from occult manuscripts hidden in the library. His voice was not his own, low, gravelly, carrying the tone of an older man. "He does not dream," a physician wrote, "he channels." The society labeled these changes manifestations of adaptation. To them, the children were not deteriorating, they were evolving. Proof that their blood carried properties untouched by decay, perhaps gifted by forces beyond the natural. But among the assistants, whispers spread that the experiments were not forging immunity, but breaking barriers between this world and another. By midsummer, strange phenomena plagued the facility. Lanterns dimmed when the siblings were brought into the chamber. Medical instruments rusted faster than they should. A black mold crept along the stone walls, no matter how often it was scraped away. The staff grew superstitious, claiming the Whitakers drew power not from their blood, but from something feeding on their suffering. Still, the society pressed forward. Disease was not the true prize anymore. Control was. If the siblings' resistance could be bent, if their strange gifts could be weaponized, the society would command power no empire, no church, no crown had ever possessed. The children had ceased being subjects. They were now prototypes. It was Jonathan who first attempted escape. The records never name him outright, but the description fits too precisely. Subject 1, male, age 13, tall for his years, exhibited calculated resistance. The log notes it clinically, as though it were nothing more than a rat slipping from a cage, but the truth was far more desperate. By late autumn of 1860, Jonathan had mapped every corner of the mill in his mind. Each time he was escorted between the dormitory and the chamber, he counted footsteps, memorized which doors creaked, which guards grew lazy near midnight. He watched the physicians fumble with their keys, learned which ones unlocked the main stairwell, which ones were reserved for the forbidden cellar. While his body endured the experiments, his mind sharpened into something harder than survival. One night, when the storm winds howled against the broken shutters, Jonathan acted. He stole a scalpel left carelessly on a tray, pressed it against the rope binding his wrist, and waited for the change of the guard. The others, Samuel, Eliza, and Ruth, watched in silence, their faces lit faintly by the lantern's glow. Eliza mouthed a prayer. Ruth, the second eldest, shook her head, already certain of the outcome, but Jonathan's jaw clenched with the fury of someone who refused to remain prey. He cut himself free. He opened the iron latch with bare fingers, tearing skin on rust, and slipped into the corridor. For 10 minutes, 10 eternal minutes, he breathed the taste of freedom. He saw the river through a broken shutter. He even touched the wooden frame of the exit door. But the society was already waiting, not by accident, but by design. They had let him run. They had wanted to see what a child would do when given the illusion of choice. 2 attendants seized him before he crossed the threshold, dragging him back by the throat. The records say only, subject, one's resilience notable, recovered after increased restraint measures. What they don't say, but what the surviving assistants whispered years later, is that Jonathan didn't scream when they caught him. He didn't beg. He simply looked back toward the river with a gaze so defiant, so unbroken, that even the guards refused to meet it. That night marked a shift. Jonathan's attempt proved the children would resist until their last breath. The society, in turn, abandoned any pretense of humane experimentation. What came next was designed not to test their limits, but to break their spirits. The punishment was not swift. That was the society's way. Quick violence might wound the body, but they sought something deeper, corrosion of the soul. For 3 days, Jonathan was denied light. They bound him in an iron chair in the cellar, where the drip of water echoed like a clock, measuring each moment of his defiance. No food, no voice, only the silence of stone and the whispers of whatever dwelled in that underground vault. When they returned for him, he was pale but unbroken. His eyes, sunken and fevered, still carried the same fire that had carried him to the door. The society could not allow that spark to spread among the others, so they made his siblings watch. Samuel, Eliza, and Ruth were forced into the chamber as Jonathan was brought forth. The attendants stripped away his shirt, revealing the marks of ropes that had cut deep into his skin. They spoke in their measured tones, always clinical, always cold. Subject 1 has demonstrated unsanctioned initiative. Corrective measures will ensure compliance. Then came the instruments, not blades, not whips, but tools of humiliation and endurance, a basin of icy water where his head was plunged until his body convulsed, a metal rod pressed against his chest, not to pierce, but to sear. They weren't trying to kill him, they wanted him to bend. And still, he did not beg. The records note, minimal vocalization, exhibited refusal to capitulate. But Samuel remembered differently. He would later claim that Jonathan whispered a single sentence through gritted teeth, "You cannot own us." The society responded by shifting their cruelty outward. They punished not just Jonathan, but the others. For every defiant look Jonathan gave, Samuel was struck. For every refusal to speak, Eliza's hair was shorn to the scalp. For every silence he held, Ruth was dragged into the chamber and forced to kneel in the dark for hours. This was the society's genius, to fracture unity, to turn love into liability. But instead of breaking, something else began to form. The siblings, though bloodied and divided, began to recognize the power of shared suffering. Each punishment became a vow, each scar a mark of resistance, and though Jonathan's body bore the heaviest weight, his eyes told the others, "Do not yield." The society had intended to break them. Instead, they had planted the first seed of rebellion. It began with whispers in the dark, not from the society, not from the guards, but from somewhere else, voices only the siblings could hear. At first, they thought it was madness, sleep-deprived minds unraveling, but the whispers said things no fever dream could know. The patterns of footsteps above, the exact moment a guard would turn a key, the hidden hollows inside the walls where air moved differently. Ruth was the first to sense it most strongly. After one of Jonathan's punishments, when she was left shivering in the cellar, she began murmuring words that weren't her own, fragments of a language that had never passed her lips. Samuel swore the stones themselves trembled when she spoke. The society, meticulous in their observations, recorded it clinically. Subject 4 exhibits anomalous vocal behavior, possible delusional manifestation. But privately, one of the attendants confessed in his notebook that he felt his bones vibrate when she whispered. Eliza's change was subtler. Her dreams grew violent. She spoke of shadowed figures standing at her bedside, pressing their hands against her chest, flooding her with visions of fire. One morning, when she woke, her cot was scorched in a perfect circle, though no flame had touched it. The society did not punish her for this. They only wrote faster, their quills scratching with feverish delight, as though they had waited for this all along. Jonathan, though scarred and half-broken in body, grew sharper. His senses stretched beyond what was natural. He could tell with uncanny precision the exact moment a guard's heart would quicken before entering the room. He knew which footsteps belonged to fear and which belonged to cruelty. Samuel once saw him stare at a locked door until the bolt slid free with a faint click, though Jonathan swore he had not moved a muscle, and Samuel himself, always the quiet one, the watcher, found his memory changing, not just remembering the present, but recalling things that had never happened. He began to describe events days before they unfolded, small things at first, a meal, a phrase, the creak of a floorboard, then larger. "They will take Eliza tomorrow," he whispered once, and when it happened exactly as he said, the others looked at him not with fear, but with awe. The punishments had not broken them, they had reshaped them. What the society believed was discipline had become transformation, and in that transformation the siblings began to understand a darker truth. The society was not simply tormenting them, it was forging them into something else. The journals of the society were not meant to be read by their subjects, but Jonathan caught glimpses, scraps of parchment left too close to the cots, careless hands of attendants who thought the broken would never look. And in those scraps, the siblings pieced together a revelation more terrifying than the punishments themselves. They were not chosen at random. Their family had been marked long before their birth. Buried in the archives was a genealogy, handwritten, ink smudged with age, that traced the Whitaker bloodline back through centuries, across oceans, into places where history bled into myth. Their ancestors, it said, were vessels for something older than the church, older than the colonies, older than America itself. A current of power, dormant but waiting, passed down through bone and blood until it converged in 4 children. The society had not built their rituals on cruelty alone. Every deprivation, every wound, every moment of terror was crafted as a key, chiseling away at the ordinary shell of flesh to expose what lay beneath. The beatings were not punishment, they were chisels. The starvation, not neglect. It was cleansing. The isolation, not cruelty. It was communion. In one passage, Eliza read words that froze her blood. Pain awakens what slumber conceals. Through suffering, the gate will open. Through the Whitakers, the threshold may be crossed. The siblings realized then what their captors had always known. The whispers, the visions, the strange powers emerging were not accidents. They were progress, proof the experiment was working. Ruth trembled as she recalled her strange speech, the language she could not understand. Jonathan clenched his fists as he remembered the door that opened under his stare. Samuel whispered the phrase "threshold may be crossed" over and over, his voice hollow, and Eliza, who still smelled smoke when she closed her eyes, understood her nightmares were not dreams at all. The society wasn't merely studying them, it was preparing them, shaping them into conduits for something unspeakable. In that moment, their hatred burned hotter than fear. They no longer saw themselves as victims trapped in a cruel experiment. They were heirs to something ancient, twisted, and powerful, and though the society thought it controlled the process, the siblings began to sense an unsettling truth. The transformation might not belong to the society at all. It might belong to them. Once the whispers of success spread through the halls of the society, the experiments changed. Gone were the crude punishments meant to break spirit and body. Now every act was deliberate, methodical, as if performed according to a script written centuries earlier. The siblings were no longer treated as children, they were artifacts, objects to be preserved, manipulated, and unveiled. Jonathan was the first to feel the shift. Shackled in a chamber lined with mirrors, he was forced to stare at his own reflection for hours while attendants chanted words from forgotten tongues. His fury boiled, and when the glass cracked, not from his fists but from the air itself, the chamber erupted in gasps of triumph. The society scribes wrote feverishly, calling it resonance. Eliza was made to sit before a fire pit, the flames fed with strange herbs that filled the air with choking smoke. She coughed, she wept, she begged, but the longer she stared into the blaze, the more the flames seemed to bend, to curl toward her like serpents recognizing their master. The overseers called it affinity. Samuel, the youngest, was left alone in the dark with nothing but his terror. For 3 nights they whispered through the cracks in the stone, voices not entirely human. By the 4th night he answered back. His words were not his own, yet his voice carried a command that silenced the whispers. The record keepers named it Dominion, and Ruth, gentle, frightened Ruth, was forced to recite prayers over and over until her voice broke. But when the words twisted mid-breath into a language no priest could recognize, the society fell to their knees. To them, she was the oracle, the vessel, the one who would speak what should never be spoken. The siblings, once bound by love and desperation, began to change. Their eyes no longer met in fear, but in a silent, unspoken understanding. What the society saw as progress, the Whitakers felt as awakening. The cage was sharpening them, not destroying them. Yet with each forced ritual, one truth grew heavier in their hearts. The society was building towards something final, something catastrophic, and the siblings could not tell whether they would survive it or unleash it. The nights inside the society's fortress grew heavier, thick with smoke, whispers, and the scrape of boots pacing stone floors. But in the silence between torments, the Whitaker siblings found one another. They spoke in fragments at first, short glances and muttered words when the guards dozed at their posts. A piece of bread slid beneath a cot, a touch of a hand to remind the other they were not alone. In those slivers of connection, something unspoken began to bloom. Jonathan was the first to put it into words. "If they're teaching us to be weapons," he whispered one night, "then we choose where to aim." Eliza nodded. Her face pale in the candlelight. She no longer trembled when the fire bent toward her. Instead, she bent it back, forcing it still, hiding her control. "They think I don't notice what I can do," she said. "But I do, and I won't let them use it." Samuel, his eyes darker than his years, leaned forward. "The whispers. They want me to listen, but I can make them listen to me. The men outside these walls don't know what they've woken." And Ruth, fragile Ruth, whispered with a steadiness that froze the others in place. "They believe I'm their vessel, but I'll never speak for them. I'll speak against them." The siblings knew the risk. Every wall had ears, every corner a watcher. If the society sensed even the smallest hint of rebellion, punishment would be swift and merciless. But the torment had given them something their captors hadn't accounted for: unity. By day they played their roles, trembling children, unwilling subjects, obedient vessels. By night they practiced in secret. A flame dimmed here, a shadow bent there, a whisper silenced before it could escape the chamber. Small, cautious acts, each one a thread in the web they were weaving. They no longer dreamed of escape. Escape meant running, and running meant being hunted. Instead they dreamed of something bolder, to burn the cage down from the inside, to make the society choke on the very rituals they had forced upon them. Their captors thought they were breaking the Whitakers, but in truth they were sharpening them into something unrecognizable, something dangerous. And though the siblings did not yet know it, their pact had already set the stage for a reckoning the society would never see coming. The rituals dragged on, each more brutal than the last. The society demanded obedience, demanded surrender. Candles flared high as the elders carved their chants into the stone air, forcing the children to kneel. It was during one such ritual that the first crack appeared. Eliza sat in the circle, her hands bound, the heat of a dozen flames pressing against her skin. The elder demanded she submit, called her the vessel of fire. She closed her eyes, willing herself to play the weak, frightened child, but the flames disobeyed. They bent toward her, not outward. The candles wavered, shrinking as if bowing to her instead of the elder's incantation. For a heartbeat, silence filled the chamber. Jonathan's breath caught. Samuel froze mid-whisper. Ruth lowered her head as if in prayer, masking her smile. The elder's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his hand slicing the air to command the fire back under his control. The flames steadied, but the doubt remained. The society had seen it. A child bending fire, not the ritual. Jonathan spoke quickly, masking the slip. "She's weak," he muttered. "She's trembling. Please stop. She can't take more." The elder lingered, suspicion carving its way into his features. He finally signaled the guards to drag them back to their cells, but his gaze followed Eliza, heavy, probing, unblinking. That night, the siblings huddled in the shadows of their cell. "They saw," Eliza whispered, her voice shaking. "Good," Samuel answered coldly. "Let them see. Let them wonder who's controlling who." But Jonathan shook his head. "No, it's too soon. If they suspect, they'll separate us, and then we'll lose everything." The siblings understood. They had tasted both danger and possibility in that single flicker of flame. The society believed they were shaping weapons, but a weapon in the wrong hands could turn, cut, destroy. From that nightfall on, the rituals felt different. The guards watched closer, the elders spoke softer, but their eyes burned harder. Something had shifted. The Whitakers had revealed the edge of their secret, and the society would not forget. The society moved swiftly after the flames' betrayal. Subtle at first, but deliberate, the siblings noticed the changes the moment they were dragged from their cell the next morning. No longer together. Jonathan was hauled to one chamber, Eliza to another, Samuel and Ruth to separate corners of the compound. What had once been a twisted ritual of collective torment was now dissected into private interrogations. The elders wanted to see who cracked first. Jonathan endured questions disguised as prayers. They asked about Eliza, her weakness, her trembling, her failure to obey. He lied through clenched teeth, painting her as fragile, broken. Every word cost him, but he delivered it with convincing despair. Eliza was tested differently. The fire was placed before her again, but now in isolation. The candles stood taller, the air thick with smoke. She fought to control herself, forcing the flames to ignore her presence. Yet sometimes they still flickered, betraying her pulse. The elder's face twitched when they did. He saw it, even if he said nothing. Samuel fared worst of all. His anger was no secret, his tongue sharp. They starved him, beat him, whispered lies through the cracks in his cell. But he endured, his silence a wall they could not breach. And Ruth, the quietest, the youngest, was approached with false kindness. Honeyed voices promised her release, a return to innocence, if only she spoke of what her siblings whispered in the dark. She lowered her head, feigned tears, and gave them nothing. At night, when they were returned to their cell, their bodies broken but their resolve intact, the siblings spoke in whispers. "They fear us," Samuel muttered, his lips split and bleeding. "No," Jonathan corrected. "They suspect us. Fear comes later." Eliza pressed her forehead against the cold stone. "If they keep us apart, how do we fight back?" Ruth's soft voice cut through the despair. "We don't fight yet, we wait. We let them believe their chains are stronger than they are." The siblings understood then. The society's attempt to break them was proof of weakness, not strength. The rituals would continue, the torment would deepen, but the balance had shifted again. The Whitakers were no longer just surviving, they were watching, waiting, sharpening their secret into something lethal. The nights grew colder, the torches outside their chamber burning lower, as if the society itself was conserving strength. That was when the siblings began to test the unthinkable. It started with Jonathan's hand. He pressed it against the floor, palm flat against the stone. Eliza lay beside him, whispering, "Don't push, just let it happen." The air around his skin trembled, a faint warmth, nothing more, like an ember buried under ash. Eliza closed her eyes and reached with her own will, not to control, but to steady. The warmth grew. A line of heat stretched between them, invisible but undeniable. Samuel, watching from the shadows, smirked through split lips. "So it's true. The fire bends when you're together." Ruth crawled closer, her small fingers hovering above theirs. She didn't touch, but she whispered, a prayer, a curse no one could tell. The heat pulsed stronger. A flicker of light glowed under Jonathan's palm. For the briefest instant, the stone itself seemed to sweat. They pulled away before it could spread, breathless, terrified, alive. That night, the guards came late to chain them for sleep. The society had noticed nothing. Eliza pressed her lips close to Jonathan's ear. "If they separate us again, we lose this. We need to stay together." Jonathan nodded. "Then we make them think we're broken. We give them what they want to see." Samuel chuckled darkly. "Play the lamb so they don't see the wolf." For days after, the siblings performed their submission. They knelt lower, spoke softer, obeyed faster. When the fire rose, they pretended it frightened them. When the lash fell, they wailed as if despair had finally taken root. The elders grew satisfied. They whispered among themselves that the Whitakers were finally unraveling. But at night, beneath the weight of silence, the siblings drew closer, hands touching, wills aligning. The fire came easier, now not as rebellion but as breath, something natural, something theirs. Ruth whispered one word as the heat shimmered faintly between them. Patience. And so they waited. Hidden strength coiled tighter with every secret test. The society still thought they were shepherds. They didn't realize the flock had begun sharpening its horns. The society announced it with drums, slow, deliberate, echoing through the stone halls like the heartbeat of some buried beast. The siblings were dragged into the atrium, the same black-tiled chamber where so many whispers of terror began. An elder stepped forward, his voice carrying the calm cruelty of a judge. "Tonight," he said, "we test the vessel." The crowd of robed figures stirred. The word carried weight. Vessel. It meant one of the children would be chosen to bear the society's mark, to be opened and filled with something no human body was meant to carry. The siblings' chains clinked as they were forced to kneel. A brazier was lit, and from its flames rose a scent sharp as copper and bitter herbs. The air grew thick. Shadows bent toward the altar at the chamber's center. Eliza's heart slammed against her ribs. She whispered so low only Jonathan could hear, "Don't move, not yet." Samuel clenched his jaw, rage burning behind his eyes, but he stayed still. Ruth trembled, though her lips moved soundlessly in her strange half-prayer, half-curse. A masked priest approached, carrying a vessel of iron, etched with symbols that pulsed as if alive. He raised it high, chanting words that made the air throb. "One among you will be chosen. One among you will carry the fire we command." The siblings felt the pull instantly. The energy in the chamber reached for them, groping like invisible hands. Jonathan's palm burned against his chain. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Ruth's whisper grew frantic. But they held. They remembered their pact, to appear broken, to appear tame. The priest's eyes darted among them, lingering on Jonathan, then on Ruth. Finally he hissed, "The vessel will reveal itself." The brazier flared, throwing sparks into the dark. The crowd gasped as the light curved unnaturally, bending toward the four siblings. Panic flickered in their eyes, but Samuel broke it with a low laugh, twisted into pain as if mocking himself. "See, even your fire mocks me," he rasped, clutching his stomach as though the energy were too much for him. The elders leaned closer, uncertain. The ritual stalled. For the first time, the siblings realized their unity could fool the society as much as it could defy it. But the iron vessel still glowed, hungry, and the night was far from over. The iron vessel burned hotter, its glow spreading cracks of light across the chamber floor. The society chanted louder, their voices rising in waves meant to break the will of the chosen child. The siblings let their bodies slump, feigning weakness. Chains rattled. Ruth sagged forward as though fainting. Jonathan bowed his head as if crushed. Samuel kept his grim smile fixed. Only Eliza's eyes betrayed the truth. Sharp, alive, watching the rhythm of the chant. She whispered, so faint the words vanished into the noise. On the third rise, give it back. The chant swelled once, twice, then a third time, and in that instant, the siblings turned inward, not toward the society's will, but toward each other. Jonathan pressed his hand to the floor. Samuel steadied Ruth's trembling shoulders. Eliza bit into her tongue until she tasted blood, grounding herself in the pain. The energy that clawed at them suddenly bent, not into their bodies but through them. The vessel flared, but its light shifted direction. Instead of sinking into the children, it split like water against stone, rebounding outward. The elders staggered, robes flapped. A few gasped as the unseen force slammed against them, twisting the chamber's air into a violent spiral. The brazier flickered, its flame nearly extinguished. One priest stumbled backward, clawing at his chest as if the fire had leapt into him. Another fell to his knees, coughing blood. Yet the siblings remained still, chains binding them, faces blank as though too broken to notice. The society saw the disruption but could not name its cause. They muttered of bad omens, of a ritual ill-prepared, of shadows interfering. But not one of them dared accuse the children, because in their eyes the siblings looked small, trembling, powerless. Only when the chanting stopped and the brazier's flame steadied did Eliza exhale, slow and silent. John. Ethan risked the faintest glance at her, the barest flicker of triumph. Samuel suppressed his laughter until it died into a cough. Ruth whispered her strange prayers, but this time her lips curved in the shadow of a smile. They had given the fire back, and no one had seen. But in the dark corners of the chamber something else stirred, watching, learning, waiting. The chamber reeked of smoke and iron. The brazier hissed as the fire calmed, but the society remained unsettled. Their chanting had faltered, their power fractured, and the whispers that followed carried fear none of them dared to name. Elder Harrow rose first, his cane striking the stone floor in a sharp rhythm that demanded silence. His face, pale and sunken, was lit by the faint glow of the vessel. "It resisted us," he rasped, "or something resisted through them." The others exchanged glances. No one wanted to admit weakness. To do so would be to fracture the illusion of control that bound the society together. Yet the truth hung thick in the air. The ritual had slipped from their hands. "They are too bound to one another," murmured another elder, her voice brittle with age. "4 minds, 4 bodies, yet one will. The vessel cannot separate them." "Then we must," Harrow snapped. The chamber hushed at his words. His meaning was clear. Divide them. Break the bond. Only then will the fire take as we intend. The decision was swift, cruel, and unquestioned. The children were not to be killed. That would waste the years of shaping. Instead, they would be unthreaded, torn from each other piece by piece, until no bond remained to shield them from the vessel's hunger. Guards were summoned. Orders were whispered. By dawn, the siblings would be taken from their shared chamber, their chains rerouted, their nights silenced. Jonathan to the western wing, Ruth to the lower vault, Samuel to the darkened hall where sound itself was swallowed, Eliza to the cold stone tower above. The society believed separation would starve the unity that had defied them. But as the elders dispersed, none saw the faint tremor that passed through the brazier's flame, as if it laughed, quiet, unseen, but alive. And in the shadows beyond the circle of light, a different power waited, drawn by the siblings' defiance. They tried to smother the bond, They thought walls of iron and guards with sharpened eyes could cut a thread woven deeper than flesh, but the society miscalculated. Alone in their separate chambers, the Whitaker siblings discovered that silence was not empty, it was alive. Jonathan, tracing his fingernails across the damp stone, tapped a rhythm he remembered from childhood. At first, it was just a memory of nights under candlelight, when their mother soothed them with simple beats. But then, faintly, impossibly, he felt it answered. Clara, in the chamber beside his, pressed her hand against her own wall, and the vibrations pulsed like a heartbeat they both shared. Rachel, confined 2 cells away, began to hum under her breath, a note so low it was almost swallowed by the stone, yet Thomas heard it in his dreams. He woke with tears on his face, knowing his sister's voice had found him even in sleep. The society monitored their breathing, their movements, their bodies, but they could not chart the map of the soul. The siblings began to weave a silent language, one no overseer could hear, a scratch here, a hum there, a rhythm tapped in the night. They learned to speak in patterns of absence, in the way silence stretched too long or cut too short. The rituals that once sought to break them now gave them more weapons. The chants, the searing light, the endless fire. They had endured them together, and those scars became signals. When Jonathan clenched his jaw in memory of the flame, Clara felt it echo in her chest. When Rachel whispered prayers to no god the society named, Thomas felt them burn into his bones. They were building something without knowing it, an architecture of resistance laid brick by brick in their blood. The society had given them numbers, chains, chambers, but the siblings had given each other something stronger, a vow carried in silence. And though the overseers never saw it, a shadow began to move along those secret threads, watching, listening. The fire that mocked the society now had messengers. The Whitaker children were no longer merely captives. They had become a single voice split across 4 throats, one defiance the society could not yet decipher. The society prided itself on precision. Every intake measured, every heartbeat logged, every silence noted. They claimed no shadow slipped past their gaze, yet something began to shift, small enough at first to be dismissed, but persistent enough to breed unease. The overseers reported that the Whitaker siblings were not breaking as quickly as predicted, their pulses steadied during trials meant to drive them to collapse. Their eyes, though hollowed by isolation, sometimes flickered with a fire that was not fear. One scribe noted, almost reluctantly, that Jonathan smiled during a ritual meant to strip him of self. It was faint, a ghost of defiance, but it unsettled the room. Whispers of synchrony crept into the records. Clara's breathing matched Rachel's, though their chambers were sealed apart. Thomas's pulse rose in perfect rhythm with Jonathan's, though no sound passed between them. The overseers could not explain it, so they scratched the words into the margins, hoping the archivists would find a pattern. And in the candle-lit council hall the elders debated. Was this mere coincidence, or had the siblings tapped something the society could not quantify? The notion was dangerous, heretical even, to admit that power could emerge outside their control. Still, doubt seeped into their voices. The rituals grew harsher, the lights brighter, the silence longer, yet the more they tightened the chains, the stronger the siblings' quiet defiance became. Overseers began to sense it, not with their instruments, but in their bones, a pressure in the air, a heaviness behind the eyes, as though the chambers themselves were whispering back. One night an overseer swore he heard tapping in the walls, but when he investigated, there was nothing. Another claimed that when Rachel closed her eyes during questioning, the torches dimmed. Laughter followed these reports, but unease left the room. For the first time, the society looked upon their subjects not as vessels, but as a threat. They did not say it aloud, but the word lingered in their silence. Resistance. And far below, in their sealed cells, the siblings felt it. The society's fear pressing against the stone, feeding the fire they had kindled in secret. At first they thought it was coincidence, a cough in one chamber answered by a scrape of fingernails in another, a rhythm of breathing mirrored perfectly, though stone walls should have smothered the sound. Yet as nights stretched long and unbearable, the siblings began to notice patterns too precise to dismiss. Jonathan tapped twice against the wall, and moments later, Clara felt the vibration echo through her bones, though no sound carried. Rachel closed her eyes in exhaustion, and Thomas woke from sleep, gasping her name without knowing why. The society called them broken, but within those fractures the siblings discovered a thread, weaving them back together. It wasn't communication in the ordinary sense, it was deeper, pulsing beneath thought. When one sibling suffered, the others felt a pressure in their chest. When one steadied themselves in defiance, strength seeped into all. It was as if their blood remembered something their captors could never chart or cage. Rachel was the first to embrace it. She began testing the unseen bond, slowing her breath deliberately and waiting. Seconds later, Clara matched her rhythm in perfect sync. Jonathan pushed further, pressing his hand against cold stone, and Thomas felt warmth where none should exist. Their connection defied the society's instruments, but it grew undeniable to those who lived it. Still, they kept it hidden. To reveal their secret would mean its destruction. So they played weak, obeyed when watched, and let their eyes dull. But beneath the surface, a resistance was forming. Not in words or plans, but in the invisible tether that no cage could sever. The siblings no longer felt alone in the dark. They carried each other's fear, each other's pain, each other's fire, and in that silent exchange, the society's greatest weapon, separation, was crumbling. The overseers wrote unpredictable fluctuations in their reports, never realizing that what they feared was not fluctuation, but union. And so, in the very chambers designed to erase them, the Whitaker siblings discovered the first true crack in the society's control, the power of their hidden bond. The society prided itself on precision, every chamber measured to the inch, every ration calculated to the calorie, every hour tracked by the endless ticking of hidden clocks. Yet something in their control was faltering. Their charts showed irregularities, heartbeats stabilizing when they should have faltered, endurance stretching far beyond predicted collapse. 4 subjects who should have been breaking were, instead, hardening. The overseers disagreed on the cause. Some whispered of contamination in the food, others blamed the acoustics of the stone corridors, claiming echoes allowed communication. A few, more cautious, suggested the siblings' blood bond anomaly was awakening under stress, but none dared put their true fear into words, that the Whitakers were adapting. Desperation bred cruelty. They cut rations further, forcing starvation to carve away defiance. They flooded chambers with freezing air, then sweltering heat, to shatter rhythm and focus. One night, without warning, they blinded Rachel with a burst of light so sharp it seared her vision for days, while Clara was plunged into unbroken darkness. They meant to unravel the hidden bond by driving wedges of pain between them. And still, it failed. For every cruelty, the siblings found a counterweight within themselves. Hunger gnawed less when they felt each other's breath steadying in the void. Cold pierced less when warmth pulsed through their tether. Even Rachel's blindness became bearable when Jonathan, miles of stone away, whispered her name without voice, guiding her through silence. The society's cruelty began to look like flailing. Their instruments spiked in panic as results strayed further from expectation. Behind locked doors, overseers argued, their voices brittle, while scribes scratched furious notes none of them truly believed. And above them all, the head archivist spoke a single sentence that froze the room. They are not weakening. They are changing. The words settled like ash. For the first time, the society feared what they could not measure. And for the first time, the siblings realized, through suffering, they had not only endured but grown. It began with silence, not the absence of sound, but the deliberate withholding of it. The society relied on the Whitakers' voices, ragged prayers, cries of pain, whispered fragments of madness, to confirm the experiments were working. For months, the chambers carried those echoes into the recorders hidden in the stone. Then, one night, the voices stopped. No whimper, no plea, not even breath shallow enough to measure. For the first time since their capture, the siblings chose to deny the society what it craved most: proof of their suffering. The technicians panicked first, fiddling with dials, tapping glass, convinced the machines had failed. When they realized the silence was intentional, a strange unease filled the observation hall. Subjects always broke, eventually. Silence was not in the design. What the overseers didn't know was that the Whitakers had practiced this rebellion for weeks, training themselves to stillness. Jonathan had taught his sisters to swallow pain without sound. Rachel, half-blind and trembling, had shown them how to slow their breathing to ghost quiet. Samuel timed the pulses of their heartbeats, creating a rhythm they all learned to follow. Clara, youngest and fiercest, whispered the rule into the dark: "We give them nothing." The silence stretched into hours into a full cycle. The society's notes grew frantic. One scribe confessed in the margin, "I feel as though they are watching us, though we are the ones watching them." When the siblings finally broke the silence, it wasn't with screams but with laughter, low, unsteady, shared across 4 sealed chambers. It wasn't loud, but it carried, thin and sharp as a blade. For the first time, the roles had shifted. The society was unsettled and the Whitakers had tasted control. The silence unsettled them more than screams ever could. To the society, suffering was predictable, measurable, but defiance, quiet, calculated, collective, was something they hadn't accounted for. It smelled of danger. The response came swift and brutal. The Whitakers were flooded with artificial light, their chambers blinding white for hours at a time. The society increased the voltage through the copper-lined walls, sending shudders through their bones. Needles appeared in place of bread, injections instead of water. The overseers scrawled furious notes: "Test their endurance, break the rhythm, force sound." Yet the siblings refused. Jonathan bit down so hard his teeth splintered, but he did not cry out. Rachel pressed her bleeding palms together in prayer, the words trapped inside her skull, never passing her lips. Samuel counted heartbeats until the shocks blurred into rhythm. And Clara, wild Clara, smiled through the agony, the curve of her mouth a blade against her tormentors. The society escalated. Isolation was no longer enough. They cut rations to starvation levels, tested poisons masked as medicine, and threatened the youngest with removal to deeper, darker vaults where subjects never return. Still, the silence held. Inside the observation hall, panic disguised itself as fury. One overseer slammed his fist against the glass, shouting that the siblings were conspiring, that they must be communicating somehow. Another whispered that this was no rebellion but possession, an outside force gripping them all. In their desperation, the society revealed something it had never intended: fear. And fear, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. The Whitakers had endured every cruelty the society could conjure. Pain became familiar, hunger became expected, but fear, that belonged only to their captors. It began so subtly the scientists didn't notice. Jonathan, half-starved and barely conscious, watched the technician's hands tremble when the levers were pulled. Rachel, her wrists bound raw, saw how the overseers looked away when she held their gaze too long, as though they feared she might see through them. Clara, the youngest, laughed under her breath. It wasn't madness, it was recognition. She had seen it in the forest when a wolf faltered in its hunt, when the predator suddenly knew it was not the strongest thing in the clearing. The siblings began to shape that fear like clay. Their silence, once the mark of submission, became a weapon. They moved in deliberate patterns, synchronized without a word. At times they pressed their palms to the concrete walls at the exact same moment. Other times they closed their eyes and tilted their heads together, as though listening to a voice only they could hear. And sometimes, at random intervals, they all smiled. Wide, knowing, unblinking smiles that sent a chill across the glass. The society documented everything, but the reports grew less clinical, more frantic. Notes that once catalogued subject response under voltage shifted into warnings. Unexplained synchronization observed. Possible contamination of thought. Subjects exhibit behaviors inconsistent with conditioning. The experiment was slipping from the scientists' grasp, and they knew it. What they had caged was no longer passive matter to be measured. It was a presence growing in defiance of their tools. The Whitakers felt it too. Not a victory, not yet, but a shift. For the first time, they were no longer only prisoners. They were becoming the threat. Each night in their cells, they pushed the illusio, and further. Jonathan carved patterns into his skin. Rachel mirrored them in the dust on her wall. Clara traced the same shapes in the air. When the guards returned, the marks had aligned as though the walls themselves had conspired. Fear was no longer theirs to carry. It flowed backward, bleeding into the men and women who once believed themselves in control. The Whitakers did not need to speak to know what it meant. Their silence was no longer survival. It was power. A rebellion without sound, a contagion of dread. And the society, for the first time, began to wonder if the experiment had already turned against them. The society believed they had built walls strong enough to contain anything, flesh, spirit, even will itself. But the Whitakers proved them wrong, not with fire or steel, but with something far more dangerous. Unity bound in silence. On the final night of the experiment, the chamber was darker than usual. Power flickered. The hum of machines, once steady, once absolute, stuttered like a dying breath. The siblings stood together in the center, no longer slouched, no longer broken. Their bodies bore the scars of the cages, but their eyes burned with a calm so unnerving it felt supernatural. The guards hesitated outside the glass. Orders screamed through intercoms demanding restraint, sedation, obedience, but no one moved. A paralysis had gripped them, not of the body, but of the mind. Every man and woman watching could feel it. The balance had shifted. The Whitakers were no longer subjects. Then Jonathan raised his hand, not in violence, not in plea, but in a deliberate gesture. Rachel mirrored him, and Clara followed, her small palm glowing faintly under the flickering light. It was not electricity. It was something deeper, something drawn from the unbearable weight of pain transmuted into defiance. The walls began to groan, not crack, not crumble, but hum, as though vibrating to a frequency only the siblings could summon. Papers flew from desks, instruments faltered. The society's precision collapsed into chaos, and through it all, the siblings never spoke a single word. Witnesses later swore the silence itself was the weapon, that it pressed into their skulls, made their hearts hammer, made their lungs choke. Some tore at their ears as if to block a sound that did not exist. Others dropped to their knees, weeping in terror, begging for the experiment to end. But the Whitakers gave no mercy. They simply stared, and when the lights went out completely, the last thing seen was their three silhouettes, standing impossibly tall, impossibly united. The files end there. No official record of what happened next survives. Some whisper the siblings vanished, dissolving into the walls, carried away by whatever force they had awakened. Others claim they remained, hidden in the dark halls of the facility, waiting, watching. What is certain is this: the society never dared repeat the experiment, and those who were present that night never again spoke of the Whitakers without trembling, because silence had become the loudest scream. The society thought they had contained the Whitakers. They thought the chamber could hold their defiance, their bond, their quiet rebellion. But history has a way of bleeding through cracks no institution can seal. No records survive in the official archives. Ask the government, and they will tell you the Whitakers never existed. Ask the town that stood closest to the facility, and they will avert their eyes, lowering their voices, as if to speak too loudly might invite something back. But lean closer, listen to the hushed conversations in taverns, in kitchens, in dim back rooms, and you will hear the same words repeated like a prayer and a curse. The siblings are still with us. Because silence is not absence. Silence is presence. Silence remembers what words cannot, and the Whitakers learned to weaponize it in ways their captors never understood. What began as a forced experiment became a communion, a language stronger than speech. Their unity, sister, brother, child, was not erased when the lights went out. It grew. It spread. There are those who claim the society still exists in fractured form, clutching at what little power remains, trying to smother the last embers of the Whitaker story. Yet even they admit, behind closed doors, that their greatest fear is not exposure, it is return. They dread the idea that the siblings' silence is not finished, that it is only waiting, rippling outward, choosing its moment. Some say the silence moves through generations now, hiding in families who wake at night with voices caught in their throats, unable to speak. Others say it gathers in places once touched by the society, dark halls and abandoned estates where even birds refuse to sing. But the most unsettling rumors are those of people who claim to have seen them, three figures, pale and unblinking, standing just beyond the edge of lamplight, watching, waiting, and so Whitaker's story does not end in a chamber or in a file marked classified. It ends in the air we breathe, in the words we do not speak, in the silences that press against us when the world goes still, because some secrets are not buried, some resist, some refuse, and the Whitaker siblings are one of them.